Hi, good evening, everyone, or good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and you're listening to this lecture. I trust you're well. Welcome to today's class. Now, today's class is very interesting because we are going to look at the energy requirements and the work output of the heart, the cardiac cycle, and function of the atria and the ventricles. Remember, this is Physiology Masterclass, and we are a channel that is trying to simplify physiology for all of those people who are pursuing any course related to medicine or having some physiology bits to it, or even for those people who are doing physiology just for curiosity. Now, initially we had recorded a lecture that tackled the first four objectives. So if you have not checked it out, kindly go to our channel and look at those lectures, because this is a build up. The lecture that you're going to have today is a build up of all the other lectures that we've done before. In the first lecture, we did the anatomical orientation and structures of the heart. We also did the physiological functioning of the heart, the excitation contraction coupling of the cardiac muscle, and we also did the phases of cardiac muscle contraction. So all of this was just based on the anatomy and the physiology of the cardiac muscle. But today's class is going to focus more on, we're going to begin with the cardiac cycle, and that is going to be our first objective. And then once we've tackled the cardiac cycle, we're going to do the energy requirements and the work output of the heart. And then lastly, we're going to finish with the function of the atria and the ventricles. So welcome once again. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button, because that helps us to grow as a channel, and it also keeps us motivated to produce more content like this. Also, don't forget to recommend us to your friends if you find these lectures to be completely helpful. We are going to develop a series for the cardiovascular system, and then once we're done with the cardiovascular system, we'll move to the respiratory system, because these two are interlinked. And then after the respiratory system, we'll move to the renal system, and then after the renal system, we'll do the neurovascular or the neurophysiology. So all of these are going to be a series of lectures that we're going to produce over a period of time. So also don't forget to hit the bell button so that you're always notified when we produce such content or when we upload any video. Now, this is what we covered in the last class. We did all of these slides, so also go back and check so that you have a better understanding before now we can come to this class for today. Now, today we are going to begin with the cardiac cycle, and under the cardiac cycle, we are going to look at the beating of the heart, and we're just going to look at how is it that the heart is able to fill with blood, and then how is it able to pump that blood out, and what is the mechanics behind the pumping mechanism of the heart. Now, I think most of you have interacted with this diagram. This is now a very good summary of the cardiovascular system, because when you're talking about the cardiac cycle, we are basically discussing about around 6 parameters. The first is we're going to look at the aortic pressure. That is the first parameter when you're talking about the cardiac cycle. We're also going to look at the atrial pressure, the second parameter. The third parameter is the ventricular pressure, because remember, the atrial pressure and the ventricular pressures are completely different. Then we are going to look at the ventricular volumes, electrocardiogram, and the phonocardiogram. Now, of course, we're not going to look at all these today. For example, let me get my eraser. For example, the ECG is going to be tackled in the next class. So this is the next class. We're going to really look at the ECG and the electrical or the rhythmicity of the heart. So for what you're going to do right now is we're just going to do an overview of the electrocardiogram. And then in the next lecture, which we're going to upload in the next 2 days, we're going to look at the electrocardiogram. So also don't forget to hit that bell button and the subscribe button. The phonocardiogram is basically the heart sounds, the sounds that are coming from the heart, or what you can hear. And mostly we use the phonocardiogram to know when the heart is defective, or maybe the disorders of the heart. Like for example, when you hear a wheezing sound and stuff. So that is what the phonocardiogram essentially helps us to understand. Phonocardiogram is what you listen to with a stethoscope. But now in this case, now it is being tabulated in a computer. So these two, we are just going to look at them later, but for today, we're just going to do an overview, a brief overview. The rest of today's lecture will sit on the ventricular pressure and the ventricular volume and the atrial pressure and the aortic pressure. These four are what you're going to discuss today, and that is why now we needed to first of all look at this diagram. When you look at it, it looks like a bit scary, but it is very easy to understand once you understand the physiology. So we'll take all the 4 parameters layer by layer so that we go as we completely understand the whole point of the cardiac cycle. So also don't forget to engage us in the comment section, in the comment section, where you feel we have not done a decent job, or where you still have questions, or maybe if you had like some specific thing that you wanted to be clarified, you can always engage us in the comment section, and then we will always revert back. So let us dive in today, the cardiac cycle and the beating of the heart. Now, when we look at the cardiac cycle, let me just take you back to this diagram here. I'm taking you to the first diagram of the heart. When we think of the cardiac cycle, the cardiac cycle is just an occurrence of activities or events that go in, so this is a cycle. You can begin with 1, then you come to 2, then you come to 3, then you come to 4, and you're moving in that direction. So that is now a cardiac cycle. And the cardiac cycle basically starts from when the heart is filling with blood all the way till when the heart is pumping out blood. And in the cardiac cycle, we have 2 chambers. The atria function as 1, and then the ventricles function as 1. There are slight differences between the right and the left, because remember in the previous lecture we said that the heart has 2 chambers. Has 2 pumps. It has the right pump and the left pump. So the left pump is the left ventricle and the left atrium, and then the right pump is the right ventricle and the right atrium. So those two are completely different in terms of pressure, and also in terms of the type of circulation where they're pumping blood through. As in the heart, the right pump will pump blood to the pulmonary circulation, and then the left pump will pump blood to the systemic circulation. So automatically you expect that there are differences in pressure, and there are also differences in the characteristics of the cardiac muscles here. But now for today, we're going to look at the cardiac cycle. Both the atria filling with blood and then emptying the blood to the ventricles, and then the ventricles pumping blood out, or filling with blood first and then pumping the blood out. So the cardiac cycle can be described in 2 broad terms. Cardiac cycle can be described in 2 broad terms. One could be diastole, and then 2 could be systole. So diastole is basically when the heart is relaxed, and then systole is when the heart is contracting, contracting. And these 2 can be used in both the atria and in the ventricles. So you'll find your atria undergoing both diastole and systole, and your ventricles will also undergo diastole and systole. So when you're looking at the cardiac cycle, we look at both the atria and also the ventricles, where they fill in with blood and how they pump that blood out, either from the atria to the ventricles or from the ventricles to the different steps of circulation, which could be pulmonary or systemic. But let us remember, there are some high yield points for you to understand before we go to the cardiac cycle. Number 1, the heart beats as a syncytium. There are 2 syncytiums, as we alluded to in the last lecture. We said there is an atrial syncytium and there is a ventricular syncytium. So that is the first high yield point you need to know. Ventricles contract at the same time, atria contract at the same time. The second high yield point that you need to understand is the atria only increase the beating efficiency of the heart by 30%. The main propulsive force to pump blood out of the heart is by the ventricles. The ventricles contribute close to 70% of the beating efficiency of the heart. So even if you took the atria away, the heart would still beat normally with the ventricles, only that the efficiency would have been reduced by 30%. Then the third high yield point for you to understand is the atria act as primer pumps for the ventricles. They simply force the last 30% of blood into the ventricles. So that is their main role. They act as primer pumps for the ventricles. And then the fourth high yield point for you to understand is before there is any beating of the heart, there has to be an action potential, and that action potential is coming from a pacemaker. Normally this pacemaker is the sinoatrial node. Now the sinoatrial node is located just at the lateral wall sorry, let me get my highlighter. The sinoatrial node is located just, you see, this is where the superior vena cava is here. Let me just delete, let me erase all ink. Good. Now, let me get my laser pointer. Now, this is your superior vena cava. Just lateral to it is the sinoatrial node. And the sinoatrial node is what you're going to look at when you'll be looking at the rhythmical excitability of the heart in the next lecture, which will be produced within 2 days. Now, the sinoatrial node will produce your action potential, and that action potential will be conducted through your atria, and they will force your atria to contract. And then all of that action potential will be taken to the atrioventricular node and then later into the ventricular or into the ventricular muscles to cause the ventricular contraction. So what you notice is the signal is coming from here, but it is ending in the ventricles. Now that tells you that the atria contract first, then the ventricles contract later. And there is a very good reason why that happens, and we will look at it when we'll be looking at the classes for today. Okay, so now we can begin our lecture. I think now that we've covered all the essentials that we needed to have known, so let us move into this lecture with that in mind. Now, the cardiac events that occur from the beginning of one heartbeat, the beginning of the next, are called the cardiac cycle. Remember, your heart beats 62 times or 70, between 60 to 100 times in 1 minute, depending on the physiological mechanisms. We will later on look at there are those people whose heart beats only less than 50 times. Sometimes that could be pathological, as in the case of maybe decompensated heart failure, and then also could be because of physiology. This person has been working out, or they've been going for some sports, so their heart is extremely effective, and so you'll find that their normal resting heartbeat is less than 50 per minute. Then could be 100. Now this is always pathological. There's no physiology. It's always pathological when you have a heartbeat more than 80. Yeah. So the cardiac cycle is similar for the left and right ventricles, although there are slight differences in ventricular depolarization and pressures related to differences in pulmonary and systemic pressures. Now remember that the right ventricle and the left ventricle pump to different circulations. The right ventricle will pump blood to the pulmonary circulation, which is not a far distance and does not have a lot of resistance, but the left ventricle is pumping blood to the systemic circulation, so essentially to all parts of your body. Now, of course, that is a very great distance to pump blood to, and there is also a lot of peripheral resistance in the systemic circulation. So, of course, you expect that there will be a lot of pressure differences in the two chambers. Each cardiac cycle is initiated by a spontaneous generation of an action potential in the sinus node. We've said that this node is located in the superior lateral wall of the right atrium near the opening of the superior vena cava, and the action potential travels from here rapidly through both atria and then through the AV bundle to the ventricles. So one thing that I want you people to note from this slide here is it is coming from the opening of the superior vena cava. That is where it is located. But the action potential, mark this word here, the action potential is traveling from here rapidly through both the atria. So it goes first through the atria and then later through to the ventricles, but coming now through the AV bundle. We will look at that in the next lecture when we'll be looking at the conduction system of the heart in the next lecture. So because of this special arrangement of the conducting system from the atria into the ventricles, there is a delay of more than 0.1 second. And this delay is very crucial because you want your atria to contract first, then your ventricles to follow later, so that all the blood that is in the atria is put into the ventricles, and then the valves will close, and then now your ventricles can generate extremely high pressures to pump that blood out. So you need first you need a delay. You need some delay for your atria to contract first, and that delay is being caused by the organization of these different structures to conduct the action potential from the sinoatrial node to the ventricles, and that is the AV bundle. So the AV bundle is also connected to this part here. Good. And then this delay allows the atria to contract ahead of ventricular contraction. So we've also said that contract ahead of ventricular contraction, thereby pumping blood into the ventricles before strong ventricular contraction begins. And so that one is well understood. Thus, the atria act as primer pumps for the ventricles, and the ventricles in turn provide the major source the ventricles provide the major source of power for moving blood through the body's vascular system. So this one, the amount of force that is being produced here is close to 70%, and the atria will only produce 30%. And so we've said because the atria are simply acting as primer pumps, what they are doing is they are simply pumping or increasing the efficiency of the pumping of the heart by 30%, nothing more than that. So I think that has been well covered in that slide. So we can move now to this big diagram here. But before we come here, let us talk about systole and diastole. Now, these two always confuse students. And let me begin by giving an example here. When you've gone to the clinic, you've seen them write for you, let's say 117 out of 92. Or you've seen them write 105 out of 69. Yeah, or you've seen them write 132 out of 97. So these values, the big one up here is what we call the systolic pressure. Systolic pressure. And then this one down here is what we call the diastolic pressure. Now, these two pressures are different because what we mean by 132 is your heart is generating a pressure of 132 mmHg in your ventricles to pump blood out of the heart. So your systolic pressure is what is the pressure that is caused when the heart is contracting. Yeah. And then your diastolic pressure now, which forms the denominator of this ratio, is what we call, this diastolic pressure is when the heart is relaxing. So that always confuses people, and I would love for you to know these two differences. Systolic is contracting, and then diastolic, the heart is relaxing and filling up with blood. Now, something that you also need to understand is during systole, there is no increase or decrease in pressure. In volume, sorry. There's no increase or decrease in blood volume. There is an increase in pressure. So let me just say, let me write it for you. During systole, so the volume here is remaining the same, but the pressure is increasing. The pressure within the chambers of the heart is increasing. Yeah. Then during diastole, the volume is increasing. The volume is increasing. Then the pressure is remaining the same. There is no change in pressure because this pressure is being generated when the heart muscles are actually contracting. But during diastole, your muscles are relaxed. So there is no change in pressure. So the pressure is the same, but the volume is increasing because now your heart is relaxing and filling up with blood. That is something else. That is also something that maybe you need to understand even as we go into this. So let me get my highlighter. So the total duration of the cardiac cycle, including systole and diastole, is the reciprocal of the heart rate. Now, like the normal heart rate could be about 72 beats per minute. Yeah. Now, you want to know because the cardiac cycle is simply cycling from systole to diastole. So when you are having, let me say, let me get my pen. So you have your systole here and you have your diastole here. So how the heart is cycling from this to this, now this is what you call the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycle is not the heart rate, because that is something that also people get wrong. Cardiac cycle is not the heart rate. It is simply the rate in which the heart is able to contract, to fill in with blood and contract within some duration of time. So also know that. So the total duration of the cardiac cycle, including systole. So when you're looking at both the systole and the diastole, let me get my highlighter. So when you're looking at both the systole and diastole, you simply take the reciprocal of the heart rate. For example, if the heart rate is 72 beats per minute, the duration of the cardiac cycle is 1 out of 72 beats per minute, which is and you need to know this figure because we'll use this figure when you'll be looking at the ECG. we will need to look at this figure and we'll be looking at the electrocardiogram. So also have that in mind. So simply take, you don't have to cram it, just know the reciprocal of 72 beats per minute. But of course, like it varies because you'll find a patient with 80 beats per minute or maybe even 100 beats per minute. So for that specific patient, the duration of the cardiac cycle will be the reciprocal of that 100 beats per minute. Because remember, the heart rate is the beating of the heart in under 1 minute. How many cycles is the heart able to go through to pump blood to all parts of the body in 1 minute? Now that is the heart rate. And of course, we'll be defining these things as we progress. But just remember from this slide, the cardiac cycle is simply the cycle between systole and diastole. And then the heart rate is the time, or is the number of times the heart beats within a single minute. So this figure, the figure is up here. This is figure 9.8, shows different events during the cardiac cycle of the left side of the heart. Of course, we're picking the left side because that is the side that shows us the real activity that is going on with the heart. Of course, like they apply to the right side with only some slight modifications based on pressures and maybe volumes. So the top three curves show the pressure changes in the aorta, the left ventricle, and the left atrium. And then the fourth curve depicts the changes in the left ventricular volume. The fifth depicts the electrocardiogram. And the sixth depicts the phonocardiogram, which is a recording of the sounds produced by the heart, mainly by the heart valves as it pumps. We also said that when we were beginning our lecture. It is especially important that the reader study this figure in detail and understand the causes of all the events shown. So you don't have to worry about, we are going to explain this whole diagram, but after we first of all understood what is happening within each. So this is just a summary. So first of all, what I want us to do is, I want us first of all to go and look at what is happening in the ventricles, and then look at what is happening in the atria, then look at what is happening in the aorta. And then now, after that, now we can bring all of that knowledge into this diagram. So you don't stress, I've got you. So what we are saying in this lecture, in this slide, is increasing the heart rate decreases the duration of the cardiac cycle. Because the cardiac cycle, we've simply said, the cardiac cycle is simply the reciprocal of the heart rate, yeah? So when you see now, because they are inversely proportional, so when you increase the heart rate, you simply decrease this one. And then when you increase, so when you increase, so what you're saying here is, let me just set that for you. When you increase the heart rate, what you're having is you're decreasing the cardiac cycle. And then when you decrease the heart rate, what you're doing is you're increasing the cardiac cycle, because these two are inversely proportional. So we can say inversely proportional. So when the heart rate increases, the duration of each cardiac cycle decreases, including the contraction and relaxation phases. And why are we decreasing? Like, what happens? Why is it that when you increase the heart rate, the duration of the cardiac cycle will decrease? Remember, increasing the heart rate will basically come from the sympathetic stimulation of the heart, because the heart, we said, it has an automatic rhythm that tells the heart beat, yeah, which is coming from the atrial node, sometimes could be from the atrioventricular node, sometimes the Purkinje fibers, sometimes even the ventricular muscles, and all of those things that I've just said, we are going to see them when we look at the electrical excitation of the heart in the next lecture. So don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. But now let's come back. When you have your heart beating, it is beating on its own, but now it has to be regulated, yeah. And that regulation is being done by the autonomic nervous system, because, that beating of the heart, so is being controlled by the autonomic nervous system. Now remember, the autonomic nervous system has three branches, yeah? We have the sympathetic, then you have the parasympathetic, then you have the enteric. The enteric is found in your gut. So now when you're looking at your heart rate, when you're increasing the heart rate, that now means you have more sympathetic activity, like the fight or flight response, yeah? When you increase your heart rate, what is happening in your heart is you are increasing the beating of the heart. So that means the heart is taking like very little time to fill in with blood and very little time to contract. So which means the cardiac cycle has been reduced, yeah? the duration of the cardiac cycle has been reduced. When you're increasing the heart rate, the duration of time that the heart takes to relax and contract has been reduced. So that means that you'll be pumping a lot of blood to all parts of the body in a very short duration of time. But when you decrease your heart rate, that means, like, for example, you're in fed state, you're just relaxing, and so your heart rate has been reduced. Now your heart is no longer there's no there's no demand on your heart for your blood to be supplied. Yeah, so your heart rate will decrease, and the duration of the cardiac cycle will increase, because now your heart will be taking in more time to fill with blood, and more time to contract. Consider what happens when, for example, you go and rob a bank. Now, when you're robbing a bank, I'm not telling you to go and rob a bank, but let's say when someone is robbing a bank, they're in a hurry to get out. So, which means like they'll be forcing everyone to lie on the floor and do all the other things quickly. That is what is happening when you increase the heart rate. When you increase the heart rate, it's simply telling the heart that we have more demand for blood. So we need to decrease the amount of time that you're taking for you to go through that cardiac cycle. We need to shorten it. If you're taking like 10 seconds, take 5. We don't have time. Now, when like you're just going to the bank to deposit your money, and let's say you have like millions, you're not even in a hurry. Yeah? You're just relaxed. So that is essentially what is happening when you decrease your heart rate. When you decrease your heart rate, your heart is telling the sympathetic nervous system, or the parasympathetic nervous system in this case, is telling your heart, we don't have much of the demand for blood in the tissues, so you can just relax, take your time to go through that cardiac cycle. And that is essentially what this slide is explaining here. So the duration of the action potential, let me get my highlighter. The duration of the action potential and systole also decrease, because remember, action potential is what we'll call systole. Systole is contraction, and contraction can never happen without an action potential. So the duration of the action potential and the systole will also decrease, but not by as great a percentage as diastole. Because in diastole, your heart is basically filling up with blood. So when you increase the heart rate, the duration of the action potential and the systole will decrease. But what will be affected the most is the diastole. The diastolic timing will be extremely reduced, because now the heart won't have enough time to fill in with blood at all. So systole will be affected, but to a lesser extent, and also the action potential. But what will be affected the most is the diastole. At a normal heart rate of 72 beats per minute, systole comprises about 0.4 of the entire cardiac cycle. At 3 times the normal heart rate, systole is about 0.65 of the entire cardiac cycle. This means that the heart beating very rapidly does not remain relaxed long enough to allow complete filling of the cardiac chambers before the next contraction. And that's why we're saying like the one that will be the most affected is the diastole, because your heart is beating quickly. So you don't have enough time to really fill in with blood. So the duration of time that will be reduced the most will be that of diastole, not systole. Because systole, your heart will still take its own good time to pump. So it will be affected, yes, but slightly. But the one that will be affected in the duration of its action will be the diastole, because now the heart does not have that enough, the luxury of time to, fill up with 6 liters and then pump out 6 liters. Okay, I'm not saying 6 liters, basically 110 mLs. So we look at the 110 mLs and the figures later when we'll be looking at the volumes of the ventricles and the atria, just within this lecture. So what I just want you people to get from this slide is, when you increase the heart rate, the high yield point is you will decrease your duration of the cardiac cycle, and that duration of the cardiac cycle will be most decreased in the diastole. The duration of the action potential and the duration of the ventricles will be decreased, but to a very small amount as compared to that of diastole. So let us come to the relationship of the electrocardiogram to the cardiac cycle. So now we are focusing now on so now we will be focusing on this part here. Sorry. This part. So now we are focusing on the electrocardiogram first. And we want to look at the relationship of the electrocardiogram to the cardiac cycle. Now, the electrocardiogram, let me just give you a brief background. The ECG is based on, number 1, your action potential. And then number 2, the duration. And then number 3, the site. Now, of course, you know your action potential is coming from your sinoatrial node. The duration of time now, there is always a delay of 0.16 seconds, and the site could be either the atria and the ventricles. So these two. So when you're looking at your electrocardiogram, always remember those three things. Your action potential, where is it coming from first? Is it coming from the sinoatrial node? Because most of the times the sinoatrial node is the pacemaker of the heart, but you'll find that sometimes it is not the sinoatrial node that is the pacemaker. You'll find maybe the atrioventricular node has taken over in cases where you have like heart blocks. So could be first degree. So in this case could be first degree heart block. Yeah. Then in the case of a second degree heart block, now it means you blocked your SAN node and your AVN node. So in the case of a second degree heart block, now you'll have your Purkinje fibers take place, taking control of your heart. And then after the second degree heart block, now you'll go to the third degree heart block, where now you've blocked the entire conduction system. And what will pick over after that is the ventricles. And so that's why we are saying that you need to know where your action potential is coming from. Is it the SAN node? Is it the AVN node? Is it the Purkinje fibers? And is it the ventricular muscles? Now, all that I've said, we're going to discuss them again in the next lecture. So I know I've said Greek, but don't worry about that. The heart blocks, we'll look at them way later when we'll be looking at heart conditions. Then the duration of action, we always have a delay. There is always a delay, because remember when we were looking at the heart, yeah, let's say that this is our heart. So this is our heart, yeah. And this is the atria, sorry, I don't know how I've drawn this thing. So let's say that this is our right atrium, right ventricle, that this is our left atrium and the left ventricle. So normally this is your atria now, and this is your atria. This atria is separated from the ventricle by a fibrous band. A fibrous band. The role of this band is just one: to prevent action potentials from moving directly from the atria to the ventricles, but instead channeling them through the atrioventricular node. So that is what you want, because you want, when your action potential is coming from your SAA node, which is located somewhere here, you want them to travel through your atria, spread through your atria, so that the atria pumps blood. And then after that, now your action potentials will be all channeled to a common point at the AV node. Then after they've accumulated at the AV node, now they will be pumped now to your ventricles. That is the normal mechanism. So this delay of 0.16 seconds is happening here at the atrioventricular node, because this is the gatekeeper. It first of all allows the atria to contract, and then later on allows the ventricles now to contract a bit later. So also don't forget that. So when you're looking at your electrocardiogram, we've talked about the duration 0.16 seconds, and where that 0.16 second is where that 0.16 second is coming from. Yeah. So let us now look at the site. Sorry. Let us look at the site. When we're looking at the site, we have the atria and the ventricles. Remember, we're just looking at, first of all, the electrocardiogram. We have the atria and the ventricles. There will be some action potentials within your atria and other action potentials within your ventricles. So the nature of those two are different, are completely different. So now let us dive in. This is now our electrocardiogram. And let us now, because now we've understood all of those parts, so let us begin with this part here. And we'll begin with, where can we begin with? Yes, let us begin with this portion, because these other portions are basically, so let's begin with this portion here. This portion is the same as this portion, so they're just the same. It's just like the normal, you see when you're drawing it, yeah, then you have your coming, then you go again, then come down, then go up, then come down again, then you see, then you go again, then you come down, then you go up, come down, up. Yeah, so you see this whole thing is just repeating itself. So this portion here is the same as this portion. So we are going to zoom in on this one, on this part here, because that is where they are labeled, and that is where it will make it easy for us to understand. So again, we are just doing an overview, but we'll have a very detailed lecture on the electrocardiogram in the next lecture. So now, as you can see, we have different types of what we call waves. There are some slight, let me get my laser pointer. there are some slight, you see, this is a normal heart resting, yeah? Then there is an action potential that has just been developed here. Then it relaxed. Then there was another action potential that developed here, a spike potential, then a drop, then another rise, and then this one here happened. Now, when you're looking at this, when you're describing the electrocardiogram, you basically look at all the three types of waves. So we have the P wave. Sorry, let me get an eraser for that. So when we are looking at our electrocardiogram, our ECG, we have number one, our P wave, and this is our P wave here. This is our P wave. Then we have number two, a complex which we call the QRS complex. And then later on we have number three, our T wave. Now what I want you to understand is the P wave is for the atria. And then these two are for the ventricles. And these waves are basically, all of these are because of an action potential developing. So the P wave is happening in the atria, so it's an action potential within an atria. QRS complex is an action potential within a ventricle, and T wave is an action potential within a ventricle. Now, when we were looking at action potentials, remember when you're looking at action potential, you have two phases. We have a we begin with the polarization, then we have a depolarization, then we have a depolarization. Then number three, we also have, let me get my eraser. So we have our, so we've said when you're looking at your action potential, you have a polarization phase, depolarization phase, you have a hyperpolarization phase. Hyperpolarization phase, and then you go back to your polarization. So these are the four phases of polarization. So when you will be looking at the P wave, the QRS complex, and the T wave, we'll be looking at them from the aspect of polarization, depolarization, hyperpolarization, and polarization. And most of these things, we've discussed them in the cardiac muscle in our previous lecture. So also don't forget to go and check that video out. So let me delete all of this so that we can now begin on the number one, the P wave. So the P wave is here. The P wave is basically what we call an atrial depolarization. Atrial depolarization. Atrial depolarization, now your action potential has gotten to your atria and it is depolarizing it or making your atria to contract. And then your Q wave, this one, you see there is a small drop here and there is a big rise and then there is a small drop. So the QRS complex is of ventricular depolarization. So your ventricles have received the action potential. Then the last one is the T wave. Your T wave is for ventricular hyperpolarization. Ventricular hyperpolarization. So you also need to know all of those three things. But now let us move to the main lecture for today. What is the relationship of the electrocardiogram and the cardiac cycle? So the electrocardiogram shows the PQRS and T waves. Sorry, PQRS and T waves, which will be discussed in other lectures. As I've said, we'll be discussing that in our next class. So these are electrical voltages generated by the heart and recorded by the electrocardiogram from the surface of the body. The P wave is caused by the spread of depolarization through the atria and is followed by atrial contraction, which causes a slight rise in the atrial pressure curve immediately after the electrocardiographic P wave. So you have your P wave here. So when that wave of depolarization has spread through the atria, it will be followed by atrial contraction. So the P wave comes first, and then contraction comes later. And that will cause a slight rise in atrial pressure. So let us look at again this one here. So I want us to combine these two here. So when there is a P wave, when there is a P wave here, so there will be an atrial contraction because the P wave is for the atria. And remember, every action potential is followed by a contraction. And where there is a contraction, that is systole now, or that is a buildup of pressure. So when your P wave has contracted or when your P wave has arrived, it will be followed by atrial contraction. Once the atrial contraction, now let us look at the atrial pressure. It is this dotted line here, the dotted line. So once the P wave has occurred, there will be an atrial contraction. Once that atrial contraction has occurred, now you'll have a small wave in your atria, which we call the A wave. So in short, what we are saying is the P wave will come first, then contraction, and then pressure. And this pressure will be recorded as the A wave. Yeah. So you have your P wave developing here, then there is contraction. Contraction builds up of pressure, and then now develops your A wave. Then now we proceed. Sorry, let me get my laser pointer. Then about 0.16 seconds after the onset of the P wave, the QRS waves, because these are just one wave, it is one wave, it is a complex, appear as a result of electrical depolarization of the ventricles, which initiates contraction of the ventricles and causes ventricular pressure to begin rising. Therefore, the QRS complex begins slightly before the onset of ventricular systole. So let us come back here. I want us to also get this. So let me erase all ink. So we've understood the P wave and the A wave. So let us now proceed to the QRS complex. Now look at the QRS complex, so it is developing. It is the ventricular complex, yeah? So now we look at the ventricular pressure, because remember, all action potentials, you must always correlate them with the pressures. In this diagram, when you'll be looking at this diagram later on, maybe in your exams, anytime you look at the electrocardiogram, always look at the pressure. So when your QRS wave is coming in, because now this is ventricular depolarization, so which means there is ventricular contraction, the pressure of the ventricles begin rising. Now this is ventricular pressure here, the red line. So your ventricular pressure will begin rising. And I want you to pay keen attention here. Where the Q wave is, there is no ventricular pressure rising. The ventricular pressure is just normal, because the Q wave is actually a drop. Then where the R wave has just begun, or it is picking a spike, now that is where the pressure begins rising. And then where the S wave is, the pressure begins getting to a constant, you get? So now what you're saying is the Q wave, the pressure is same. But where the R and S have peaked, now the pressure begins, you begin rising your pressure. So I think that is well covered, because that is what we essentially needed to know about that. And then now when we look at the last part of the lecture, finally, the ventricular T wave represents the stage of repolarization of the ventricles when the ventricular muscle fiber begins to relax. Therefore, the T wave occurs slightly before the end of ventricular contraction. Look at this. Look at something here. Let me erase all of this ink. Look at where the T wave is. Sorry. Look at where the T wave is. Where the T wave is, the ventricles, the pressure has begun dropping but has not completely gotten to zero. So the T wave is happening just before the ventricles begin relaxing. That is what I wanted you people to understand. The pressure is still high. Where the T wave is developing, the pressure is still at its peak. It has begun to drop, yes, but not significantly. So it's still at its peak. So the ventricular pressure is normal, but the T wave has begun developing. And remember, the T wave is a hyperpolarization wave. So which means it is the wave that is causing your ventricles to begin contracting. So of course it has to happen quickly or even earlier before that. So those are the things that I wanted you to correlate the relationship of the electrocardiogram to the cardiac cycle. So when you look at these, when you look at these two, when you look at this diagram, we've now covered this electrocardiogram, we've covered ventricular pressure, and we've also covered atrial pressure. We're going to look at the C wave and the V wave later. So just don't worry about the C wave and the V wave. I know that's what we've not covered there. So let us move to, sorry, let me erase all ink from this slide. The atria functioning as primer pumps for the ventricles. Now, this is something that we've really sung. We've said that the atria will always function as primer pumps for your ventricles. Your ventricles produce the main pumping force. Your atria simply increase the efficiency of beating of the heart. And how they do that is they force the extra 30% of blood into the ventricles. It's like, for example, when you have water in a balloon, yeah? And then you filled that balloon, but not to the maximum. So for you to continue filling that balloon to the maximum point, you have to add more water. Now, for you to add that more water, it means like you need to have some force that is forcing in the water into the balloon itself. So now that is what the atria is essentially doing when we talk of the cardiac muscle. So let me get my highlighter here. So the atria play important roles in ventricular filling and cardiac function in three phases. When your cardiac muscles are filling up, they fill in three different phases. They normally don't fill at once. Yeah. Initially, blood empties from the great veins and pulmonary veins into the atria, which we call the reservoir phase. So reservoir phase is our first phase. So your blood will empty simply from the great veins and pulmonary veins into your atria. Then in early diastole, remember now we are still in the atria. Diastole, now your atria are relaxed. In early diastole, about 70 to 80% of the blood will flow directly through the atria into the ventricles, even before the atria contract. That is what we call the conduit phase. Because remember what we said in the previous lecture slide, that the atria, like the heart basically generates pressure, or generates like negative pressures to suck in blood and then positive pressure to pump out blood. So when your heart is completely having no blood in it, of course your heart can't have completely no blood. It has to have like 70 mLs in it, which we will later look at, and it is called the end systolic volume. So when your heart is having like the least amount of blood in it, there is a lot of pressure, negative pressure in it. So it's like a vacuum sucking in blood from the atria. So in the reservoir phase, your atria will first of all fill in with blood, but that blood is trickling down to your ventricles because the ventricles don't have anything in them. So of course now it's like an open, the valves are open, so already your atria is just allowing the blood to pass through. So those are the first two phases. Reservoir phase, where your blood is coming from the great veins, which is your superior and inferior vena cava, and even from your pulmonary veins into the atria. Then they will go through a conduit, which now we call the conduit phase, directly into the ventricles without even your atria doing anything. Then now we will now move into the atrial contraction, because now we've done with the atrial systole. Yeah? Now your atrial contraction will act as a booster pump, causing an additional 20 to 30% filling of the ventricles, which we call the contractile phase, and that will end the filling, the ventricular filling. So later on, when your ventricles have filled up with blood, but there is still room for more, your atria will contract and force the remaining 30% of your blood into the ventricles. Now you see what has happened. 70% got into the ventricles without your atria doing anything. It was just like passive. But now when your ventricles got to some level, but there's still more room for more blood, now your atria will come in and pump the rest of the 30% into the ventricles, and that is what we'll call the contractile phase. Therefore, the atria function as primer pumps that increase the ventricular pumping effectiveness as much as 30%. This is a very high yield point for you to know. So, however, the heart can continue to operate under most conditions even without this extra effectiveness, because it normally has the capability of pumping 300 to 400% more blood than is required by the resting body. Therefore, when the atria fail to function, the difference is unlikely to be noticed unless a person exercises. Then symptoms of a heart failure occasionally develop, especially shortness of breath. And now you've heard of people having like what you can call atrial heart failure. Mild. This is always mild because your heart will always continue beating without you necessarily undergoing the most prominent or the most visible type of heart failure is when your ventricles fail, because now that means your heart won't pump blood anymore. But when you don't have your atria, your heart will still pump blood, only that the effectiveness has been reduced by 30%. So that is the function of the atria. The atria simply function as primer pumps for the ventricles. So let us now look at the pressure changes in the atria. Yeah, let us begin with the atria. Let us look at the A, C, and the V waves. Now, it is here. These three waves are what you're going to focus on here, the A, C, and the V waves. Let me just highlight them that way. Now that is our pressure, that's our application point. Now in the atrial pressure curve, three minor pressure elevations called the A, C, and V atrial pressures are shown. Again, it is simply this curve that I've just come to this curve and I've just taken away this part, because first of all, I want us to understand individual parts before we can understand the full thing. So in the atrial pressure curve, three minor pressure elevations, which we call the A, C, and the V atrial pressure waves, are shown. The A wave is caused by atrial contraction, because remember we said that the P wave will result to an A wave, because the P wave is an action potential and then contraction, and then I will give you the A wave. Remember, these three waves are pressure waves. Now they are not action potentials like the P, Q, R, S, and T. P, Q, R, S, and T, those are action potentials developing. But now your A, C, and V, those are pressure waves. So the A wave is caused by atrial contraction. Ordinarily, the right atrial pressure increases 4 to 6 mmHg during atrial contraction, and the left atrial pressure increases about 7 to 8 mmHg. These figures are a must to know. You must know these figures. Your right atrium will always have lower pressure as compared to your left atrium. And the pressure in the right atrium is normally between 4 to 6. The pressure in the left atrium is normally between 7 to 8. Those differences are critical for you to know. So the C wave will occur when the ventricles begin to contract. Because when the ventricles contract, they will cause the valves to bulge. You see, the valves are normally this way, yeah? So when they're allowing in blood from the atria to the ventricles, they'll open this way and then they'll close. So when your ventricles are contracting from down here, they will cause the valves to bulge upwards into the atria. So when they're bulging upwards, they are increasing the pressure in the atria, and that's why you'll now have your C wave developing. So the C wave occurs when the ventricles begin to contract. It is caused partly by slight backflow of blood into the atria at the onset of ventricular contraction, but mainly by bulging of the AV valves backward toward the atria because of increasing pressure in the ventricles. So I've explained that point really well. The C wave is simply because of the bulging of the valves backward because of increasing pressure in the ventricles when your ventricles are undergoing systole. The V wave occurs toward the end of ventricular contraction. Now, not something here. The C wave is beginning when the ventricles begin to contract, but the V wave is occurring when the ventricles are close to the end of their contraction. So also that's another difference you need to know. It results from slow flow of blood into the atria from the veins while the AV valves are closed during ventricular contraction. Then, when the ventricular contraction is over, the AV valves will open, allowing this stored atrial blood to flow rapidly into the ventricles, causing the V wave to disappear. So also know that there are, so we've simply said that. So let us go through a quick recap of that. Yeah. So we've said that the A wave. Sorry, let me get my pen. We've said that the A wave. Yeah, the A wave is resulting from the P wave. And this is basically because of atrial contraction. Then we've said that our C wave will occur at the beginning of ventricular contraction, yeah. And then what is majorly causing this to happen is bulging back of the valves. Bulging back of valves. And why are the valves bulging back? Because of the pressure in the ventricles. Then we'll have our V wave. Our V wave will happen towards the end of ventricular contraction, yeah? And then this one will happen because there is partial filling of blood in the atria, because there is closed valves. So your valves are closed, your blood is coming in from the veins, so that will now cause a slight buildup of pressure, and that is what we will essentially call the V wave. So those are the three types of waves that I wanted us to really understand. So those waves are of the atrial pressure. And look at the characteristics of these waves. These waves don't go beyond 20. So the pressures here, the AC and V waves, will range from 4 to 6 in the right atrium, and then they will range from 7 to 8 in the left atrium. So that is also high yield for you to remember. Now let us look at the function of the ventricles as pumps. So we are already done with the function of the atria. The atria simply act as primer pump. So let us now move to the function of the ventricles as pumps. The ventricles fill with blood during diastole. So remember, we've talked about the atria. The atria has atrial systole, atrial diastole, and atrial systole. Now let us move to the veins, to the ventricles. The ventricles, they also have ventricular diastole and they also have ventricular systole. Now let's begin with ventricular diastole. Ventricular diastole is when your heart is relaxed and it is filling in with blood. So let us briefly go through this slide here. During ventricular systole, let me get my highlighter. Yes. So during ventricular systole, yeah, we've begun with systole. Large amounts of blood accumulate in the right and left atria because of the closed AV valves. Remember where we've begun? We've begun with your ventricles are contracting, so your valves are closed. So if your valves are closed, it does not mean that the blood is not flowing into the heart. The blood is flowing into the atria when your ventricles are undergoing systole because of the closed valves. Therefore, as soon as the systole is over in the ventricles, as soon as the contraction is over in the ventricles, and the ventricular pressures fall again to their low diastolic values, the moderately increased pressures that have developed in the atria during ventricular systole immediately push the AV valves open and allow blood to flow rapidly into the ventricles. And we'll look at that later. This period is called the period of rapid filling of the ventricles. In a healthy heart, the period of rapid filling lasts for about the first third of diastole. During the middle third of diastole, only a small amount of blood normally flows into the ventricles. This blood that continues to empty in the atria from the veins and passes through the atria directly into the ventricles. So during the middle third of your diastole, you will have the blood that is continuing to empty from the atria, from the veins, and passing through the atria directly into the ventricles without your atria doing anything. Then, during the last third of diastole, the atria will contract and give an additional thrust to the inflow of blood into the ventricles. So the ventricles stiffen with aging or diseases that cause cardiac fibrosis, such as high blood pressure or diabetes mellitus. This causes less blood to fill the ventricles in the early portion of diastole and requires more volume. That is the preload, which we'll discuss later, or more filling from the later atrial contraction to maintain adequate cardiac output. So what are we saying in this slide? In this slide, we're simply saying that number one, in your cardiac filling, so let me get my pen. In your ventricular filling, in your ventricular filling, we have three phases. The first phase is rapid filling. And remember, this phase is coinciding with the reservoir. Yeah. Then the middle portion, which coincides with the conduit phase. And then we have our last portion, which we call the third portion, which will go together with the contractile phase. So this is the atria. So this is the ventricle, and then this is the atria. So when you're having the period of the first third of diastole in your ventricle coincides with the reservoir phase in your atria. The middle third of diastole will coincide with the conduit phase of your atria, and then the third phase, or the last third of diastole will coincide with your contractile phase of the atria. And also remember, we've also said that the ventricles will stiffen with aging, and once that occurs, like for example in the case of cardiac fibrosis or diseases that cause cardiac fibrosis, as in the case of maybe diabetes mellitus, or maybe even you have high blood pressure, there will be less blood to fill the ventricles because now your ventricles are stiffened. Later on, we will look at a mechanism which we call the Frank-Starling mechanism. We'll look at that later on. So when your ventricles are stiffened, it means like they can no longer expand to fill in with blood like the others, or like the normal heart does. So which means you will increase the number of blood, the rate of blood flowing into your heart, so that you maintain the same cardiac output. Now there's a difference between the cardiac output and your heart rate. And we also have, your heart rate is simply the beats of the heart, but your cardiac output is the volume. What volume of your heart goes, what volume of your blood goes out of your heart in 1 minute. So for you to maintain the same number, again, those terms, you're going to define them when you'll be looking at the different terms of the cardiovascular system. So when you have your cardiac output, for you to maintain the same cardiac output, so the cardiac output is normally at between 4.5 5 liters of blood. So for you to maintain that same amount of blood and your heart is stiffened, it means that you have to increase the amount of blood that is coming into your heart, which we call the preload. Preload is the amount of blood that is coming into your heart to be pumped out of your heart to all the other parts of the body. So for you now to maintain that cardiac output, it means that you have to increase your preload. So this causes the less blood to fill the ventricles in the early portion of diastole, and requires more volume or more filling from the later atrial contraction to maintain adequate cardiac output. And I believe that slide has been well covered. Now this is what majorly they're saying. I think we have this is what majorly they're saying here. You have your ventricular volume here, yeah, and then you have your ventricular pressures here. Now we are focusing on this ventricular pressure because the slide was the ventricles filling in with blood. So look at how so this is the volume, yeah. Look at when the pressure is increasing, the volume is decreasing. When the pressure is decreasing, the volume is increasing. You see that relationship? Because this is ventricular volume, the blue one, then the ventricular pressure is the red one. So anytime your pressure is increasing in your ventricles, the volume is decreasing. Why? Because now your heart is pumping blood out. Then when your heart is relaxing, your volume will begin rising again, because now your heart is filling in with more blood. Now you get. So now that is just the relationship. Anytime your pressure in your ventricles decreases, your volume is increasing. And anytime that your volume is increasing, your pressure is decreasing, and vice versa. So let us look at outflow of blood from the ventricles during systole. Now we've tackled already diastole. We've looked at the 3 phases of diastole in your ventricles. Now let us come now to systole. Now systole is when your heart is contracting. And it is a bit technical, so I want us to pay keen attention here. We are now focusing on the cardiac, on the ventricle. We are now not in the atria. So there is a period of isovolumic or isometric contraction. Isovolumic, iso means same. And then volumic, of course, means volume. Isometric, same length. So isovolumic means same volume. Isometric, same length. So during isovolumic contraction, now we've begun our systole, yeah? Before your ventricles can contract, number one, what will happen is your valves will close. The atrioventricular valves are closed, the semilunar valves are closed. Now we go into ventricular contraction. When we are beginning our ventricular contraction, what will happen, one, is that the volume will not change, because now you've closed your semilunar valves, so there's no blood going out, and you've also closed your atrioventricular valves, there's no blood coming in, so the volume is the same. That is now what we call isovolumic contraction. So because the volume is the same, now your muscles will begin pumping, or will begin contracting. They are not changing the length, they are simply building up the pressure. So they will begin contracting, because the change in length will only come because of the bulging, yeah, when they were filling in with blood. But now because there's no change in volume, so which means there is no change in length. So that is why they call it isometric contraction. So your heart will begin contracting. So the volume is not changing. The length of the muscle is not changing, because we are not bulging anymore, but we are building up pressure. So the pressure is there, rising. So let us now study this slide here. Immediately after ventricular contraction begins, the ventricular pressure rises abruptly, causing the AV valves to close. Then an additional 0.02 to 0.3 second is required for the ventricle to build up sufficient pressure to put the semilunar, that is the aortic and pulmonary valves, open against the pressures in the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Therefore, during this period, contraction is occurring, yes, in the ventricles, but there is no emptying. But no emptying occurs. This period is called the period of isovolumic or isometric contraction, meaning that the cardiac muscle tension is increasing, but little or no strengthening of the muscle fibers is occurring. And I think we've explained that so well. So now let us come to the period of ejection. The reason why we were building up pressure without even opening the semilunar valves is because semilunar valves are they're not flexible. They're totally rigid valves. Those valves will only open under pressure. So that's why our ventricles had to undergo that phase of isometric contraction. Now, your ventricles will now need to develop enough pressure to open those valves. In the left ventricle, you will need to go above 80 mmHg. And in your right ventricle, you will need to go above 8 mmHg. So now you can see that your left ventricle is generating close to 10 times the pressure in your right ventricle. Yeah. So that is now why we were developing that high amount of pressure. Now, when you get to above 80 mmHg, your semilunar valves will be forced to open. And now the blood in the ventricles will be pumped out with extreme force. That is now what we call the period of ejection. But it is not all the blood that is pumped out. Normally, by the time you're filling in your ventricles can hold a maximum of 110 mLs of blood. So by the time you're pumping out, you're only pumping out close to 70 mLs. So what you remain with, what we call the end systolic, is around 70 minus, so that is 110 minus 70, so 40. So it's normally between 40 to 50 ml. This could be between 100 to 120 mLs. So that is normally the figure. So you don't pump the entire blood out, you simply pump a portion of it. So let's look at the period of ejection. So normally, when the ventricular pressure rises slightly above 80 mmHg and the right ventricular pressure rises slightly above 8 mmHg, the ventricular pressure pushes the semilunar valves open, because remember again, you said that for these valves to open, let me get my laser. So for these semilunar valves to open, you need to have pressure. So immediately blood is ejected out of the ventricles into the aorta and the pulmonary artery. Approximately 60% of the blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole is ejected during systole. This is called the ejection fraction. So ejection fraction is that amount of blood that is pumped out of your heart at the end of ventricular systole, and it is 60%. Then about 70% of the 60% of this portion flows out during the first third of the ejection period, with the remaining 30% emptying during the next 2/3. So let us do the mathematics here. Yeah? So let's say that you have pumped out 70 mLs. Yeah. So 60% of these 70 will be pumped out during the first 2/3 of ejection, and then the remaining 30%. Sorry. The remaining, let me get my eraser here. So this is taking up 70%, sorry. The 70 mLs, so let's say like you have 110, yeah, mLs. Now this is 100% of your blood in your ventricles. But out of this 100, you will only pump out 70, which is close to 60%. Then you'll remain with 40 mLs, which is now, that is 40% now. So the 40% is what remains in the heart, but now 60% is what you're pumping out. Now we are saying out of this 60% of the 70 mLs, 70% of that will be pumped out in the first 2/3, and then 30% of the 70 will be pumped out in the last 1/3 of the ejection fraction. So the one that is pumped out during 70%, that is what we call the rapid ejection fraction, and then the one that is pumped during the last 30% is what we call the slow ejection fraction. So those are again high yield for you to know. So what you're saying is approximately 60% of the blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole um, is ejected during, so let me get my laser pointer. So approximately 60% of the blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole is ejected during systole. This is called the ejection fraction. And about 70% of the 60% of this portion flows out during the first third of the ejection period, with the remaining 30% emptying during the next two-thirds. So therefore, the first third is called the period of rapid ejection, and the last two-thirds is called the period of slow ejection. So what you're saying is the first phase is normally the smallest. The 70% will be pumped out quickly. That will form the first third of the period of rapid ejection. And then the 30% will come in later, and it is the slow one, which will now form the slow period of rapid ejection, and that will take close to two-thirds of the ejection period. So let us now come to the period of isovolumic or isometric relaxation. Now, after your ventricles have contracted, they will now after they've pumped out blood, there will be negative pressure that will build up in the ventricles. So which means your pressure has dropped. Now your semilunar valves will close automatically because there is a drop in pressure. So once the semilunar valves have closed, and remember your atrioventricular valves have closed, now you don't have any change in volume still. That is now what we still call isovolumic relaxation. So there is no change in volume. There's no blood that is coming in. There's no blood that is going out. But now your heart is relaxing itself. So now that is what we call the period of isovolumic or isometric relaxation. And this normally occurs at the end of systole. So at the end of systole, ventricular relaxation begins suddenly, allowing the right and the left intraventricular pressures to decrease rapidly. The elevated pressures in the distended large arteries that have just been filled with blood from the contracted ventricles immediately push blood back towards the ventricles, which snaps the aortic and pulmonary valves closed. Because whatever causes the closure of the aortic and pulmonary arteries are two. Number one is the drop in pressure in the ventricles, and then number two is the backflow of blood. Because when those, you see, these valves are normally like this. So when blood is coming out, they normally go like this, and they allow blood to go out. So when there is a reversal in blood, now blood will come to these edges and will cause these valves to close. So that is why they say the backflow of blood will cause the aortic and the pulmonary valves to close, and they close through a snap. They snap. Those are very rigid valves. So for another 0.03 to 0.06 second, the ventricular muscle continues to relax even though the ventricular volume does not change, giving rise to the period of isovolumic or isometric relaxation. And during this period, the intraventricular pressures rapidly decrease back to their low diastolic levels. Then the AV valves will open and begin a new cycle of ventricular pumping, and the cycle now will continue. So let us look at this as we conclude our cardiac cycle. Let us define these terms: end diastolic volume, end systolic volume, stroke volume output. So let us begin with end diastolic volume. End diastolic volume is the volume of blood in your ventricles at the end of atrial diastole. At the end of ventricular diastole, sorry. So when your ventricles fill completely, the maximum amount of blood that your ventricles can hold, that is the end diastolic volume. And it normally ranges between 110 to 120 mLs. That is the maximum that your ventricles can hold. So what are we saying? End diastolic volume is the volume of blood that is present in your ventricles at the end of ventricular diastole or at the end of atrial systole. So take a time to understand that. Then, once you have done your end diastolic volume, the next volume that should come to your mind is the stroke volume output. When your heart is pumping out blood, it does not pump the entire 110 to 120. It pumps out a small percentage, which we've just called the ejection fraction. But the ejection fraction is completely different. The ejection fraction is completely different from the stroke volume output. The stroke volume output is that amount of blood that is pumped out of the heart, which is about 70 mLs. So then, as the ventricles empty during systole, the volume decreases by about 70 mLs, which is called the stroke volume output. Stroke volume output, the output of the heart, what is it pumping out? So it normally pumps out 70 mLs. So what you're saying is 70 mLs is the amount of blood that the heart pumps out within a single beat. Then the remaining volume in each ventricle, which is about 40 to 50 ml, is called the end systolic volume. So end systolic is what remains at the end of ventricular systole. Now let us focus on something here. Yeah, the fraction of the end diastolic volume, the fraction of the end. Let me get my highlighter. Yes, my highlighter here. The fraction of the end diastolic volume that is ejected is called the ejection fraction, usually equal to about 0.6 or 60%. The ejection fraction percentage is often used clinically to assess cardiac systolic or pumping capability and to classify types of cardiac failure. So what I want you people to understand is the ejection fraction is similar to the stroke volume output because that is now 60 to 70%. But now the ejection fraction is a percentage. The stroke volume output is a volume. So normally you'll just go for your ejection fraction when you need to know like maybe the pumping capability of the heart, because it will now tell you when you convert maybe 70 mLs to percentage, it will tell you like this percentage is 60%. So now you know your heart is within the normal range. Then, so now this last part here, when the heart contracts strongly, the end systolic volume may decrease to as little as 10 to 20 mLs. Why is that so? Because if your heart is contracting strongly, it means it is forcing a lot of blood out at once. So which means the end systolic volume, the amount of blood that is supposed to remain in the heart, will reduce considerably from 40 to 50 to between 10 to 20 mLs. And conversely, when large amounts of blood flow into the ventricles during diastole, the ventricular end diastolic volumes can become as high as 150 to 180 ml in a healthy heart, because that could happen maybe because you are exercising. Yeah? So your heart muscles will have a greater capacity to hold in blood because there is increased venous return. So venous return is the amount of blood that is coming from your veins into your heart. Yeah. So now it will increase all the way from 110 to 120 up to 150 to 180 mLs, and this will be mediated by something we call the Frank-Starling mechanism. The Frank-Starling mechanism of the heart, which we will explain in a separate lecture. By both increasing, let me erase all ink and have this highlighter. By both increasing the end diastolic volume and decreasing the end systolic volume, the stroke volume output can be increased to more than double that which is normal. Because when you decrease when you lower the end systolic volume, which is the amount of blood that remains in your heart, and you increase your end diastolic volume, the stroke volume will be increased close to double. So for you to increase, what you're saying, for you to increase your stroke volume, what you need to do is you need first of all to decrease your end systolic volume and increase your end diastolic volume. So that is what you need to do for you to increase your stroke volume output. And why do you need to increase your stroke volume output? This one could happen either because of exercise, or maybe you are cardiac, maybe you are hypertensive, could be because of heart failure, or could be because of cardiac fibrosis. So those are the reasons why you'd want to increase your stroke volume output. Now, there's something that I want us to understand before we even leave the slide. What I want us to understand is let me type it here. The stroke volume times the heart rate will give you the cardiac output. Your heart rate is beat per minute. Then what else did I want to write? For you to know like the duration of the cardiac cycle, you simply take an inverse of your heart rate. So these are equations that you need to know because that will be forming the foundation of our next lecture. So when we come back in our next lecture, let us go back to the objectives. In the objectives, this is what we have covered so far. We have covered the cardiac cycle, and we've covered the function of the atria and the ventricles. Now, the energy requirements and work output of the heart, this one will be covered in a separate lecture, because our next lecture is going to be cardiac excitability of the heart plus the energy requirements. So these two always come together. Energy requirements and work output of the heart and your rhythmical excitability of the heart always come as a bundle. So we'll do them together in the next lecture, which will be produced in the next 2 days. So thank you so much, guys, for staying with us up until this point. We really do appreciate that you've been with us, and we really hope that this lecture has been high yield. It was just measuring on the cardiac cycle and function of the atria and the ventricles. Kindly don't forget to subscribe. That really motivates us. Also like hit us up to your, or link us up to your friends and even associates, or even people who you know will or have a keen interest in physiology, so that we can all grow together and learn in the same environment. I am Ian Mwita Matiko. I am 4th year from the School of Medicine and Pharmacy, taking a bachelor's degree in pharmacy, and that brings me to the end of today's lecture.